the gift that keeps on giving, I suppose, the United Nations. The UN, as with the League of Nations, there were noble ideas behind the creation of such organizations. Can we possibly try to stop international war and injustice and confrontation? That would be lovely, but it hasn't turned out that way, has it? We have so many countries that are Islamo-fascist, former Soviet countries, they had about 16 votes, dictatorships, telling parliamentary democracies they have to improve the way they behave. Hillel Neuer, Director of UN Watch, joins us now from New York. Welcome to you, sir.
Thank you.
Now, what have they been up to now? I could say that to you every day and you'd have a new story for me, but what has the UN been up to now?
Well, in the past few days, the past weeks, we've seen some statements and some actions that are really shocking for people who want the United Nations to work, who believe in its fundamental mission to promote peace and human rights. You know, in the past month, Sudan was elected to a major UN body that oversees human rights commissions and takes action on a range of human rights issues called ECOSOC. Sudan was elected as a member and then as vice president, and then was nominated to chair its humanitarian affairs segment. Sudan, of course, is a country whose leader is wanted for genocide and crimes against humanity for the mass killing of black Africans in Darfur. We've had Syria elected to a committee that deals with decolonization, and that its mission is to deal with human rights issues against subjugation of people. Syria, of course, has killed 70,000 people, if not more, in the past year or so. Pakistan is just taking its seat this week on the Human Rights Council. Pakistan is a haven for terrorists. And just 2 days ago, we had the Turkish Prime Minister, Erdogan, speaking at a United Nations global forum called the Alliance of Civilizations, which is meant to promote mutual tolerance of all people, in particular between the West and Islam, but really for all people, and to fight bigotry. And he took the microphone and he said that Zionism is a crime against humanity. Not a single UN official, including Ban Ki-moon, said anything during that day. Only when our organization, UN Watch, exposed that hateful speech and put it on the internet, the speech, then we had a torrent of criticism around the world. I'm glad that Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, today has spoken out firmly, condemned those remarks, and as we meet now, I'm expecting Secretary of State John Kerry, who's in Turkey, to condemn those remarks as well in his meetings with Erdogan. But these are United Nations forums, United Nations entities, which should be sending a message of human rights, tolerance, and peace, and by their actions and statements, they are either giving a platform or endorsing messages that give the very opposite signal.
Of course, it is the nature of the beast, and maybe I use the word beast advisedly. When you have so many dictatorships and racist states in the United Nations, their turn will come to be in charge of various bodies and committees and commissions, as you know. And whilst you look at those names, and there's Ireland and Japan and South Korea and even some more moderate Gulf states, which is a good thing, so many of them are dictatorships. But then probably most of the countries in the UN are horrible, intolerant, anti-democratic nations. Well,
well, you're absolutely pointing to an inherent problem with the UN as it appears today, with 193 states, many of them which are non-democratic and indeed tyrannies. And so, as you say, their turn will come. It need not come. You know, the Human Rights Council was founded in 2006 with the express requirement that every candidate, there's only 47 nations on the Human Rights Council, and those 47 ought to be countries, according to the UN's own criteria, that promote and protect human rights. And yet we've seen the regime of Hugo Chavez was just elected, Pakistan, a haven for terrorists, which allows women to be gang raped by tribal edict. We just hosted in Geneva a summit on human rights, and we had Mukhtar Mai, this woman who 10 years ago was gang raped by tribal edict, and her rapists were just acquitted a year or two ago. According to UN's own criteria are to exclude those people, and yet they're being elected. The issue is, what are the democracies doing about it? And in Vienna 2 days ago, Erdogan gives a hateful speech calling Zionism a crime against humanity.
Okay, let me move on from that.
And no one speaks out.
Hold on, we've already said that. Why, though? Why is it then? Why is it that so many countries, and it's not just those that are ambivalent, there are some countries, and you question some of what they do, but efforts are being made. But we're talking about outrageously, ostentatiously unpleasant regimes. Why isn't it that enough people at the UN do not stand up and say, no, we can't have you here?
There's a lack of moral courage. I think it's quite simple, and it's sad. I mean, the Churchills we had at the UN in 1975, Ambassador Patrick Moynihan from the US, who stood up and spoke out. He spoke truth to power. And today, too often, diplomats want to go along to get along. And that's not going to get us where we need to go with the United Nations, which is supposed to promote human rights and at times can do the right thing.
Should we try and get rid of it?
No, the United Nations is not going anywhere, and that is a magic formula which is not going to solve things. There are many UN agencies that do good things, but the key forums, including the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, and others, have been hijacked. We need Canada, the United States, the European powers to speak out. On Sudan, when Sudan was first elected, the only one who spoke out after we protested was the Canadian government, Foreign Minister John Baird, and we salute him for that, as for other things that he's done and said at the UN. But the US and the EU were silent. Actually, a U.S. ambassador tweeted that it's only ceremonial. Well, guess what? All UN human rights resolutions are ceremonial. They're non-binding. But it sends a message. Words matter. And I'm glad that the U.S. and the EU and Canada have now objected to Sudan being given the humanitarian affairs portfolio. And apparently that's been withdrawn, and they'll get another portfolio which is less offensive. So the fact is that they can be effective when they're willing to stand up and show some moral courage, show some spine.
You know, I used to believe, as you, I think, do, and that's because you're a decent person, that much of the work of the UN is noble and it needs to remain because of that. I am convinced that the vast bulk of the good work the UN does, through often its vicarious organizations abroad, that could be done by other people, probably more efficiently and more cheaply. The politics of the UN now are so perverse, I don't believe there's any reform possible.
Well, the fact that you may be right, but the UN is not going away, and those stakeholders who are present, groups like ours, UN Watch. The sad thing is many human rights groups don't speak out as often as they should on UN abuses. Some of them are too close to the UN. So those who are there are going to have to speak out. The UN is not going away, so we need to work with it.
All right. And you do great work doing that. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.